You already know the feeling. You pick up your phone for no reason. You scroll for 20 minutes. You put it down, and there it is. That hollow, slightly disgusted feeling that has no name and no explanation. You didn't want anything. You didn't find anything. You just did it. Again. That's not a bad habit. That's not a discipline problem. That's something far more unsettling. A behavior that originated somewhere you cannot see, executed by a part of you that never asked for your permission. And if you're honest, it's not just the scrolling. It's the relationship you keep repeating with slightly different faces. The procrastination that survives every productivity system you've ever tried. The rage that arrives way too large for what actually happened. The decisions you make that seem, in retrospect, like someone else made them for you. You watch yourself do these things. You don't understand why. And eventually, you stop asking. That's the real problem. Not the behavior, the silence around it. Most people go through their entire lives operating as though they are the conscious narrator of their own story. They believe they choose based on reason, values, intention. They believe they know themselves. What Freud understood, and spent his entire career trying to prove, is that this belief is the most sophisticated lie the mind tells. The conscious self is not the driver. It's the passenger reading the map, convinced it's steering. Sigmund Freud, the founder of psychoanalysis, was the first to map the architecture beneath that lie. In his structural model, developed most completely in the ego and the id, he argued that the vast majority of what you think, feel, and choose is controlled by forces operating entirely outside your awareness. Not metaphorically, structurally. The machinery of your mind is running processes you have no direct access to, and those processes are writing your life in real time. Carl Jung, who built on Freud's foundation and shattered several of its walls, took the argument further. He showed that the unconscious doesn't just contain repressed memories and buried impulses. It contains entire structures, entire characters, entire worlds you've never met, but that have been shaping you since childhood. The person you think you are is not even the full story. It's the edited version, the acceptable version, the one you built to survive. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly how your psyche is structured, the forces inside you, what they want, why they conflict, and what they do when you're not looking. You'll stop experiencing your own behavior as mysterious. You'll start seeing the logic underneath everything you've been calling chaos. But I'll warn you now, this is not comfortable knowledge. Understanding how your psyche works means looking directly at the parts of yourself you've spent years carefully not looking at. It means accepting that you are not who you think you are, and that the version of you currently in charge might be the least free version that exists. If you're willing to sit with that, keep watching. This is where it starts. You think you make decisions. You think you chose this video, chose what to eat this morning, chose how you reacted to that message you received last night. You think choice is something that happens at the surface, visible, deliberate, yours. That assumption is the foundation of everything you've gotten wrong about yourself. Freud's most radical contribution wasn't a therapy technique or a theory of sexuality. It was a map. A map of the mind that revealed something most people still haven't fully accepted. That consciousness, the part of you reading these words right now, the part that narrates your life and calls itself I, is the smallest, least powerful region of your entire psyche. Think of an iceberg. The tip above water is what you can see, what you can name, what you believe is real. That's your conscious mind, your current thoughts, your immediate feelings, your stated intentions. It feels like everything because it's all you have direct access to. But beneath the surface, invisible and massive, is the unconscious. And the unconscious is not a storage room for forgotten memories. It is an active, intelligent system running continuously, processing, deciding, driving, without ever asking for your input. Freud showed this with clinical precision in The Ego and the ID. He demonstrated that the unconscious isn't simply what's been forgotten, it's what's been actively kept out. Traumas too large to process, desires too threatening to acknowledge, fears that would destabilize everything if they were allowed into the light. The mind buries these not out of weakness, but out of strategy. Repression is a defense mechanism, and like most defenses, it creates more problems than it solves. Here is what that looks like in your life. You meet someone and feel an immediate, inexplicable unease you can't justify. You're sitting at your desk and suddenly you'd rather do anything, clean, scroll, reorganize, than start the work. You end a relationship and immediately begin another one that will end the same way, for the same reasons, with a different face. None of these are random. None of these are mysterious. They are the unconscious executing patterns that were written long before you were old enough to question them. The unconscious doesn't speak in sentences. It speaks in repetitions, in reactions that are too large for their trigger, in the body that tightens before the mind knows why, in the dreams you wake from with a feeling you can't name. It is constantly communicating, and you have spent most of your life fluent in every language except that one. What Freud gave us is not a reason to feel helpless. It's the opposite. Once you understand that there is a system, that the chaos has a structure, that the patterns have a logic, you stop being a victim of your own mind and start becoming a student of it. The unconscious is not your enemy. It's the part of you that has been waiting with enormous patience for you to finally pay attention. But knowing the unconscious exists is only the beginning, because what lives inside it isn't one voice, it's three, and they've been at war since the day you were born. In the next part, we'll meet them, the id, the ego, and the superego, and you'll recognize all three of them immediately, because you've been hearing them your entire life. You just didn't know what they were. If this content is making sense to you, click the subscribe button and subscribe to the channel. Thank you for your support. You are not one person. You never were. The experience of internal conflict, wanting to do something and simultaneously not wanting to, knowing what's right and doing the opposite anyway, feeling pulled in directions that make no logical sense, is not a character flaw. It is the accurate perception of a mind that contains multiple competing forces, each with its own agenda, its own logic, and its own idea of what you should do right now. Freud named them the id, the ego, and the superego. Not as metaphors, as structural realities of the psyche, each operating by different rules, each fighting for dominance in every moment of your day. The id is the oldest part of you. It existed before language, before reason, before you had a name. It operates entirely on one principle: get what you want now, without consequence. The id doesn't negotiate. It doesn't plan. It doesn't care about your long-term goals, your relationships, your self-image, or what happens tomorrow. When you feel the pull to scroll instead of work, to eat the thing you said you wouldn't eat, to send the message you know you'll regret, that's not weakness. That's the id, doing exactly what it was built to do. It is pure appetite, ancient and relentless. The superego is the id's opposite and equally dangerous. It is the voice of every rule you were ever handed by your parents, your religion, your culture, your school, your social group. It is not your conscience. It is an internalized authority that never stops judging. The superego doesn't say, "That wasn't your best." It says, "You are bad." It transforms every failure into evidence of your fundamental inadequacy. When you can't rest without guilt, when you achieve something and feel nothing, when you spend your life performing goodness for an audience that exists entirely inside your own head, the superego is running the room. Between these two stands the ego, the mediator, the part of you that has to function in the real world, that has to balance what the id demands with what the superego permits, while also managing actual external reality. A healthy ego can hold that tension. It can tell the id not now without destroying it. It can tell the superego enough without collapsing under the weight of defiance. It can make a conscious choice instead of just reacting. Most people don't have that. Most people have an ego that's been so eroded by overstimulation, by constant digital noise, by a culture designed to keep the id perpetually activated and the superego perpetually punishing, that it barely functions as a mediator at all. What's left is a life that lurches between impulsive gratification and crushing self-judgment, with almost no space for genuine autonomous choice in between. That's not living. That's being bounced between two extremes and calling it a personality. The scrolling fits perfectly into this structure. The id wants stimulation. Now, effortlessly, endlessly. The superego punishes you for wasting time. The ego, exhausted and overwhelmed, has no capacity to intervene. So the cycle continues. Not because you're weak, because no one ever showed you the machinery. But Freud's map stops at the threshold of something even deeper. Because inside that unconscious, beneath the id's hunger and the superego's verdict, there are structures Jung discovered that Freud never fully explored. One of them is the mask you've been wearing so long you've forgotten it's a mask. That's where we're going next. There is a version of you that is very good at being acceptable. It knows what to say in a meeting, how to seem confident at a party, when to perform warmth and when to perform competence. It has learned with extraordinary precision exactly what this world rewards, and it delivers that consistently at the cost of almost everything else. Jung called it the persona, the mask. Not a lie exactly, more like a strategic edit. A curated selection of traits deemed safe enough to show, shaped by years of social feedback. What got you praised, what got you punished, what made people stay, what made them leave. The persona is built from data, and it works. That's the trap. Because the persona is useful, you start to trust it. Then you start to prefer it. Then slowly, you start to become it. You stop distinguishing between the mask and the face underneath. You stop asking what you actually want, what you actually feel, what you actually believe. Because those questions lead somewhere the persona can't follow, and the persona has become your only map. Jung was precise about what this costs. When a person identifies entirely with their persona, when the mask becomes the self, they don't disappear dramatically. They fade. Life continues. The performance continues. But underneath, there is a growing sensation that something essential is missing, that no achievement lands, that no relationship reaches the part that needs to be reached. Because the part that needs to be reached was sealed off long ago, behind the mask that was supposed to protect it. You've felt this. The exhaustion that has nothing to do with how much you slept. The loneliness that persists even when you're surrounded by people who believe they know you. The strange flatness after getting exactly what you said you wanted. These aren't symptoms of ingratitude or depression or a life poorly constructed. They are the accurate signal of a self that has been performing for so long it can no longer locate what's real underneath the performance. The persona isn't the enemy. It has a function. Social navigation requires some degree of managed presentation, and Jung never argued otherwise. The danger is total identification. The danger is forgetting that the mask is a tool, not a truth. The danger is building an entire life on top of a layer that was always meant to be temporary. And here's what makes this particularly difficult to undo. The people around you have grown attached to your persona. They expect it. They need it. Dropping it, even slightly, even privately, feels like a betrayal of every relationship built on top of it. So you keep wearing it, and the distance between the mask and whatever lives beneath it grows wider every year. What lives beneath it is what Jung called the shadow. And this is where the conversation gets genuinely uncomfortable. Because the shadow isn't just the authentic self you've been hiding, it's everything you've decided is unacceptable about yourself. The rage, the envy, the hunger, the selfishness, buried so deep, you've convinced yourself it isn't there. It is there. It has always been there. And in the next part, we'll look directly at it. Because what you've been refusing to see is almost certainly what's been running your life. If what you're hearing resonates with you, you'll find real value in my ebooks. Beyond the Shadow breaks down Jung's core ideas, while Dialogues with the Unconscious gives you a 30-day path to apply them in your life. Both are linked in the pinned comment. Think of the person who irritates you most, not a mild annoyance, the one who provokes something disproportionate in you, the colleague who takes credit for others' work and makes your blood boil, the friend who is needlessly cruel and leaves you furious for days, the stranger online whose arrogance you find genuinely unbearable. Hold that feeling for a moment, because Jung had something to say about it that you are not going to like. The intensity of your reaction is data, not about them, about you. Jung called it the shadow. Everything you have deemed unacceptable about yourself, the cruelty, the envy, the hunger for power, the selfishness, the parts that don't fit the persona you've so carefully constructed, doesn't disappear when you reject it. It gets pushed underground. It accumulates in the unconscious, growing denser and more pressurized with every new thing you refuse to acknowledge. And then, reliably, it finds its way out, not through your own behavior, which you monitor and control, but through your perception of others. You see in them exactly what you've buried in yourself. The technical term is projection. The lived experience is moral outrage that somehow always finds the same targets. This is not an accusation. It is a mechanism. The psyche doesn't project randomly. It projects precisely. The trait that provokes the strongest reaction in you is almost always the trait you've worked hardest to disown. The person who cannot tolerate arrogance in others has usually suppressed a powerful need to be seen. The person who is disgusted by laziness is often exhausted by their own relentless internal pressure. The person who finds selfishness morally intolerable has likely spent years denying their own legitimate needs in order to be loved. Jung argued in the Archetypes that the shadow is not pathology. It is the necessary counterweight of the conscious personality. Every time you develop a strength, its opposite gets pushed into the shadow. Every time you commit to an identity, responsible, kind, selfless, disciplined, the opposite of that identity accumulates in the dark. The shadow is not evil. It is everything human that didn't make the cut. And here is what it does when you refuse to acknowledge it. It leaks into relationships as irrational jealousy or sudden cruelty you can't explain, into decisions as self-sabotage that arrives precisely when things are going well, into the body as tension, illness, exhaustion that has no medical cause. The shadow doesn't wait for permission to exist. It simply finds less direct roots. The more completely you deny it, the more completely it governs you. This is not poetry. This is clinical observation from over a century of psychoanalytic practice. The work Jung prescribed, what he called individuation, begins here. Not with fixing your habits or optimizing your morning routine. It begins with turning around and facing what's been following you. Acknowledging that the rage is yours, that the envy is yours, that the hunger and the fear and the pettiness are yours, not shameful evidence of your inadequacy, but legitimate parts of a complete human being that have been starving for recognition. You don't integrate the shadow by acting on it. You integrate it by seeing it clearly, naming it without flinching, and stopping the exhausting project of pretending it isn't there. That recognition alone changes the pressure. What is seen cannot possess you the way what is hidden can. The question now is practical. You understand the structure, the unconscious, the id, the ego, the superego, the persona, the shadow. You can see the machinery. But knowing the name of the cage doesn't open it. In the next part, we'll go into what it actually looks like to work with all of this, not as theory, but as a daily confrontation with the self you've been avoiding. Here is the thing. No one tells you about self-knowledge. Understanding your psyche doesn't automatically change anything. You can know about the shadow and still project. You can recognize the id's pull and still scroll for an hour. You can identify your superego's voice and still obey it. Knowledge is not transformation. It is only the precondition for it. The actual work is different, slower, less comfortable, and far more specific than anything a productivity framework has ever offered you. The first move is the simplest and the most consistently avoided: pause. Not meditate, not journal, not optimize. Just pause. When you feel a strong impulse to reach for the phone, to avoid the conversation, to explode, to agree when you mean no, stop for 10 seconds before you act. That gap is not small. That gap is where the ego lives. Every time you create it, you are strengthening the only part of your psyche capable of making a genuine choice instead of executing a reflex. The second move is to name what's actually happening, not the surface behavior, the structure underneath it. When you feel the pull to scroll, ask, is this the id demanding stimulation, or the ego genuinely needing rest? When the inner critic tears into you for a mistake, ask, is this my actual value system, or a superego I inherited from someone who no longer has authority over my life? Naming creates distance. Distance creates choice. You cannot choose differently from inside an automatic reaction. You can only choose from outside it. The third move is to track your patterns as if they were messages rather than failures. Freud was precise about this. Repetition is not randomness. If you keep ending up in the same dynamic in relationships, the same wall in your work, the same spiral after a certain kind of success, that repetition is the unconscious trying to show you something it cannot say directly. The pattern is not your enemy. It is the most honest map you have to where the unprocessed wound actually lives. Jung added something to this that Freud resisted. He said, look at what you cannot stand in others, and look at it seriously, not defensively. Make a list if you have to. The 5 traits that provoke your most disproportionate reactions are almost certainly the 5 things most deeply buried in your shadow. You don't have to act on them. You don't have to celebrate them. You just have to acknowledge their presence, because the moment you do, they lose the power that invisibility gave them. None of this is comfortable. Integration is not a pleasant process. It requires sitting with the parts of yourself you have spent years constructing elaborate systems to avoid. It requires questioning voices inside your head that feel like your own values, but are actually inherited verdicts from people who shaped you before you had any defense against being shaped. It requires tolerating the anxiety of not immediately gratifying every impulse while also not punishing yourself for having it. What emerges from that work is not perfection. Jung was explicit. The goal of individuation is not to become wholly good or wholly rational or wholly anything. It is to become whole, to stop spending enormous psychological energy suppressing half of what you are, to let the persona be a tool instead of a prison, to let the shadow be seen instead of feared, to let the ego function as an actual mediator instead of a casualty of 2 forces louder than itself. The scrolling, at its core, is a flight from this work. It is the psyche choosing noise over confrontation, stimulation over stillness, the outside world over the interior one that demands something from you. And the final question, the one this entire video has been building toward, is not whether you understand all of this. It's whether you're willing to stop running. That's where we're going next, and it's the hardest part. Here is the truth you've been circling this entire video, the one you half hoped wouldn't get named directly. The scrolling was never the problem. Procrastination was never the problem. The patterns, the impulses, the mask, the rage, none of them are the problem. They are all symptoms of one thing: the refusal to turn inward and face what's there. That refusal is not weakness. It is ancient and understandable. The interior is where the unprocessed pain lives, where the version of you that was hurt before you had language to describe the hurt is still waiting, still reacting, still writing the script of your adult life from a place you've never revisited. Of course you don't want to go there. The phone is right there. The noise is right there. The endless, frictionless current of other people's lives is right there. And it costs nothing, and it asks nothing, and it leaves you exactly where you were. That is the design. Not a conspiracy, a convergence. The technology was built to exploit the id's most primitive hunger: novelty, stimulation, the possibility that the next thing will be the thing that finally satisfies. It never satisfies. It was never meant to. And every hour you spend inside it is an hour the shadow grows a little denser, the ego a little weaker, the distance between who you are and who you are performing a little wider. Freud spent his career arguing that what is repressed does not disappear, it returns. Jung spent his arguing that what is not integrated does not stay buried, it possesses. Both were saying the same thing in different languages. You do not get to opt out of your own psyche. You only get to choose whether you engage it consciously or get dragged by it unconsciously. There is no third option. There is no version of this where ignoring it works. The war worth fighting is not against your impulses. You will not win that war by force. The id cannot be defeated. It can only be understood, negotiated with, given legitimate channels. The superego cannot be silenced by willpower. It can only be questioned, traced back to its origins, stripped of the authority it never legitimately had. The shadow cannot be destroyed. It can only be seen, and in being seen, lose its grip. This is not self-improvement. This is something older and harder and more necessary than that. This is the project of becoming a conscious human being in a world that profits enormously from you remaining unconscious. So here is the challenge: not a to-do list, not a set of habits, a single, non-negotiable act of honesty. The next time you reach for the phone to escape something you're feeling, stop. Not forever, just for 60 seconds. Sit with whatever is underneath the impulse. Let it be uncomfortable. Let it be unclear. Let it ask something of you. That moment, that 60 seconds of not running, is where the real work begins. Everything Freud mapped, everything Jung uncovered, every concept in this video collapses into that one small, enormous act of staying present with yourself. You already know more about your psyche than you did an hour ago. The question is what you do with that knowledge when the discomfort arrives. And it will arrive, probably within the next 10 minutes. That moment is the test, not of discipline, of willingness. If this video made you see something you hadn't seen before, say it in the comments. Naming what you've recognized is the first act of bringing it into consciousness. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want to keep going deeper. This channel exists for the people who are done being lived and are ready to start living. And if you're ready for the next step, the next video is already waiting for you. Because understanding your psyche is only the beginning. What you do with the shadow, how you actually face it, integrate it, stop letting it run your relationships and your choices, that's where it gets real. Don't stop now.